Hi there, my name is Dilia Ramirez of JX3 Inspirations, and I am on the Wow Embossing Powders blog with this mixed media Christmas canvas. I am their creative guest for the month of November 2021, and I'll be giving you a brief tutorial on how I put this mixed media canvas together. So let's get started. The first step I always do on my canvases or the surfaces I use for mixed media projects is to coat them with a white coat of gesso. Depending on the color of the canvas, you can either do transparent, black, or white gesso. Here I coated the surface with a bit of water while applying the white gesso, and in between coatings I dried it with the Wow Embossing dual speed heat tool using the high speed. I then coated all of the resin pieces or paper clay pieces that I thought I would use in my project as well with gesso, so that any type of medium you apply to them can easily adhere to it. Then I opted to go with a designer cardstock to go under my embellishments. And so I cut a small piece, I ripped the edges off and distressed them with water and my scissors, and then realized the piece was a bit too big, so I ended up cutting it down a bit more and distressing those edges. Here I'm just checking placement of all the embellishments and how I thought I wanted the project to go. It always changes as you go along in these projects, and you end up not using half the stuff you wanted to use at the beginning and end up adding additional pieces at the end. So that's what ended up happening here. But I then continued with my project. I found a few more pieces I wanted to use, so I again added gesso to them. I applied a coat of titanium white acrylic paint over them, thinking that would be white enough, but no, it wasn't. So I opted instead to use embossing powders, the same way that I did in my last project for Wow. I used their mixed media embossing brush, and I used their opaque bright white embossing powder. I coated that with the powder. I used a heat tool on the first setting, which is the low setting. Since resin kind of melts when you heat it, you don't want to apply too much heat. You have to be careful not to overheat it. I then went on and applied iced teal to certain areas of these embellishments. So I ended up coating the surface with the mixed media brush, and then used both powders, the opaque white and the teal and the ice teal, and then heat set that, being careful not to overheat it, of course. You really need to see the outcome of this in real life. It is beautiful. The shiny coat that you come out with ends up looking almost like porcelain, which is why I really like doing this now with that mixed media embossing brush. It does give the resin pieces a totally different look than if you were to apply plain acrylic paint or any other type of medium. I then applied rose glints to a resin flower, and the same way, applying the embossing brush and then applying the powder and heat setting that. Look at the shine you get as the powder melts. Okay, here I found a piece of wood that was small enough but big enough to fit behind the canvas, so that I can have a hard surface where I could then press my wooden stamp onto. I used a stamp positioner so that I could restamp multiple times that image as I knew I would need to get a crisp image. And I ended up using the St. Valentine color of the Stays On ink pad just because it doesn't smudge with water, and in mixed media, you're always spreading water to all types of mediums. Then here I applied some Ranger's multi-matte medium or multi-medium matte glue to adhere the cardstock to the canvas, and then applied a coat of clear gesso to this surface to protect the sentiment as well as the paper so that no water or mediums would get absorbed by the paper. Then I applied a thin coat of white gesso over that. I then decided to stamp the foliage background outline stamp set from Wow onto the cardstock, and I applied that with white puff embossing powder. This is a powder that ends up puffing up when you heat emboss it, looking a bit like snow, which is part of the theme here with this canvas, wanting to make it look like a snowy scene. Then I here am removing excess powder in areas I didn't want it, and heat embossing the outlined foliage. I then attempted to apply that same stamp set in different areas of my canvas, and because the canvas is soft in the center, it's very difficult to apply a good detailed stamped image onto that surface. So it didn't work out. I ended up covering it up with some opaque crackle paste by Ranger. I'm here separating the edges of the cardstock from the canvas so that they would remain raised. I then decided to add some stars to the center of the project, and I ended up using texture paste mixed in with Rosy Cheeks embossing glitter, and used the Starry Night stencil by Wow. Here it is mixing them up. It ends up giving them a really pretty look once you heat emboss that afterwards. Here, I then realized there were a few stars that weren't completely filled in, so I replaced the stencil and applied more paste to those stars. And then I am cleaning up. You definitely need to clean up your stencils right after using texture paste. Otherwise, it'll dry rock hard and it will be impossible to remove from the stencil. So highly recommend that. I then cut up a piece of cheesecloth to place behind my embellishments, which will go on top of the cardstock. And I am playing around with placement, seeing how everything is looking so far, and deciding on what additional embellishments I'm going to apply to the project. Here I noticed that my meat under the mistletoe embellishment was not high enough, so I applied a piece of foam behind it so that it could remain above all of the embellishments that would go around it. I then applied the cheesecloth with some multimedia matte glue, glued as well the embellishments behind it, and there is that piece of foam that makes it pretty dimensional. I am playing with additional embellishments, seeing if I want them in the project or not. In case you were wondering where I got the embellishment of the doves, it was a Silhouette Design Studio design that I purchased and cut out with my Silhouette machine. Here I'm using white puff again to coat the edges of the roses and the different embellishments I used in the project, and certain parts of the canvas as well, just to give it that snowy look, as if everything was coated with snow. I attempted to do that with this flower. That's a plastic flower, and once I heat set that, the flower kind of separated and it just didn't work out. So I took it out and I replaced it with a different paper flower instead. Those berries on that mistletoe also gave me a bit of a problem. I heat embossed them after applying the embossing powder over them, but they are so thin, and the plastic is so soft that it completely melted the berries. I ended up having to take them out and replacing them with some new ones. This time I decided to add multimedia matte glue and adding the powder without heat embossing it so that those berries wouldn't melt. I glued that onto the mistletoe and moved on to applying more embossing powder over the embellishments. And as I had that bad experience with those berries and that flower, I opted not to heat emboss all of those plastic embellishments. Just glued the embossing powder over them and let it be. This is a wooden reindeer, and because it's wooden, I did heat emboss that. I'm now stamping the foliage background bold stamp set on my Misty using the Superior Smooth White cardstock from Wow. This paper is very smooth and very bright, and pretty thick. So I love embossing images on it. I wiped the stamp set since it's new, and then using their embossing pad, I inked it up, and the clear embossing pad inked it up, and then it's ready for embossing glitters, which is what I used here, the teal, the ice teal, and the rosy cheeks embossing glitters. And once I applied the glitter to the areas I wanted them in, I cleaned all that up and heat embossed it. Once that was heat embossed, I then fussy cut several of those foliage pieces and applied them to my project in several different areas. And here they are, all fussy cut, embossed and all. Very pretty and shiny. I then decided to remove all the embellishments that I had in place, temporarily in place, and attempted to use this Art Alchemy Metallique acrylic paints. This one in purple is supposed to be a very pretty purple, but when I wet that, when I sprayed water over that, you can see that the water turned black, and that's definitely not the color I was looking for in this canvas. So this was a very challenging canvas to work on, as several of the techniques I tried using didn't really work on it, and I had to improvise and change my course, which happens a lot in mixed media, but this one in particular gave me some workout. So as you see here, I applied both of those colors, and definitely too dark, not what I was looking for. So I went with this vintage rose instead to see if, that lighter pink would blend well with those colors, would cover them up. And that did the trick somewhat. I ended up adding some white titanium white acrylic paint over that as well, just to cover some more of the darker areas that I knew were not going to get covered by my embellishments. Ended up leaving some that I knew would get covered, as that isn't going to matter. Because the sentiment here is in red, I needed to add some touch of red somewhere other than the berries. So I added this poppy red impasto paint from Finnabair to a few spots in the canvas. Later on, you'll see me add some diamond dots that are also in red, very little. Here I then added a bit of rosy cheeks to continue adding some lighter colors to this canvas, and some pretty glitter over the areas that would be seen. So I used the rosy cheeks, and I also ended up adding more of the white puff. And then started kind of assembling, putting back together how I wanted all the pieces to go before gluing everything. I needed another rose, so I ended up adding some multimedia matte glue over the edges of this rose and adding white puff over those edges to make them again look like the other one that looks as if it had snow over it. And then I continued adding my embellishments and glued everything in place using the Ranger's multimedia matte. There I added a piece of dimension to that foliage. It was a foam dot behind that foliage, and then I added some white titanium with my finger, just spread out some more white to brighten up those areas. I found these table toppers that are in the shape of snowflakes and added those in there as well. They're very pretty and shiny. Here again, adding some glue, but also some foam dots behind the deer so that it can stay raised as if it's jumping over those branches. Here, the Meet Me Under the Mistletoe frame was a bit wobbly and tilting to the right, so I added a piece of cardstock to the right side to make it straight and steady. Then I added some gold flakes to several areas around the canvas using the multimedia matte glue to apply it with. And here are those diamond dots I was telling you about, just to add some red accents to kind of make that red Merry Christmas sentiment blend in with the project. And here, once my project was almost finished, I decided I needed some stars. I ended up covering most of the stars I had added previously and knew that this project needed some additional white touches. And so the stars were perfect. I added them on the upper right here. I'm sorry that they were out of frame, but I did add some to the bottom left of the canvas and then moved on to adding some on the right side over the cardstock. And this is my favorite step because I know that I'm at the end of the project. Here I mix some water with titanium white and using the fan brush, hitting the fan brush, I ended up getting some white splatters all over the canvas, taking care to cover the sentiment so that they don't get the splatters all over them. I ended up adding just some additional embossing glitter here. It's called Powdered Snow, and it's a much lighter pink than Rosy Cheeks. It's almost white, but it's very pretty and very glittery, and that finalized my project. And here it is. I hope you liked the project. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial. And if you'd like to see a written tutorial, head on over to the Wow Embossing Powders blog, where you'll find more pictures and information, including all the products used for this project. Thank you again, and until next time.